Shalom and welcome everyone to the TV studios of the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem. And I'm David Parsons, Senior Vice President for the Christian Embassy, bringing you another edition of our ICEJ webinar series. It's great to have you with us. We've got this really current hot topic about waiting for Iran to attack and how should Israel respond. It's a question of when we titled this show, but now it may be if. We're going to see if there's continued delays. We've been a week now since Israel took out the senior military commander of Hezbollah in Beirut, and also the death of the Hamas Politburo chief Ismail Haniyeh in Iran, in Tehran itself. And there's still some question about how he was targeted and exactly who took him out. But Iran and Hezbollah have threatened massive retaliation for this. And to help sort out where we are and what to expect next, we've got our old friend, IDF Reserve Major Elliot Chodoff. Good to see you, Elliot.
Good to see you. Good to be back.
Yes, Elliot Chodoff is a leading Israeli military and security analyst, over 35 years in the IDF. He's written some of their field manuals and is a trusted consultant in the war on terrorism, and also serves with the IDF Home Front Command in the north. And you see him, many of you may be seeing him regularly on I-24 News. He's also a frequent guest and a good friend of ICEJ. It's good to see you, Elliot. It's actually been relatively quieter than what we were expecting the past week. Are you surprised?
First of all, nothing surprises me in the Middle East. I'm not surprised because if Hezbollah in particular, and as you said, we said when, but now we're saying if. I'll say when, if, when, because I think there are a lot of things connected in there. If Hezbollah is planning a massive strike, they don't want it disrupted by what I'm going to call an unintended result, similar to what happened in Majd al-Shams when the 12 children were killed. In other words, they didn't plan to kill those 12 children. They fired the rocket intentionally into a civilian area with population. And that was a possible consequence. It was a foreseeable consequence, but that was not their targeting intention. And they know very well that every time they fire a rocket, every time they send a drone, the chances of that happening again in one variation or another are very high. And that could kick off an Israeli response that would preempt whatever they're planning, not intentionally preempting, but the effect would be Israel would have the initiative then, and not Hezbollah. Mm-hmm. So I think the quiet is the sort of the calm before the storm kind of a quiet.
Okay, you sort of brought up how this latest escalation in tensions happened. That Hezbollah was firing, they say, at a military base, an IDF base near these Druze villages on the northern Golan at foot Mount Hermon. And one of the rockets, it was hard, it came in low over Mount Hermon and landed in Majd al-Shams, killed 12 children, many others wounded. And it was, Israel had to respond, and very, very succinct and accurate response in taking out this longtime senior military commander for Hezbollah, Fuad Shukr. Tell us a little of his background.
Okay, so first of all, Shukr, as you said, a long-standing character. He goes back to the early days of Hezbollah. He was the deputy of Imad Murnia until Murnia was taken out about 15 years ago in Damascus, and what seems to have been an Israeli-American joint operation. And Shukr, along with Murnia, were involved in the bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks in Beirut in the early 80s, in which 241 American servicemen and women were killed. Two bombings of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, also the Israeli installation in Tyre twice. So he had a long history, and not just as a soldier, if you will, but as a senior commander. And when Moniya was taken out, and I intentionally don't use words like assassination, these are legitimate military targets and they're terrorists. So he became part of a group that kind of became the ruling military echelon of Hezbollah, all of whom have been taken out along the way. He was instrumental in turning Hezbollah from a terrorist organization to a terrorist army. And in terms of training, organization, liaison with Iran, and so on. And of course, what was important in taking him out were a few things. First of all, the United States had a $5 million bounty on his head for information. And here, I'll be happy to collect the $5 million because I can tell you exactly where he is right now after his funeral. But the State Department, by the way, is a $5 million State Department reward. So the State Department couldn't really come out very strongly against the Israeli strike when they had $5 million on his head. But in addition to that, the strike was in Beirut in a neighborhood called the Dahia, which is the Hezbollah center where their headquarters and where their leaders are. And America had warned Israel not to strike either in Beirut and certainly not in the Dahia. So by taking Shukr out there, it sort of preempted and prevented an American condemnation of the attack. Because, again, how could America condemn taking out a guy that they had a $5 million bounty on? So that was on that side of it. And with that, Israel stopped, because at the same time, we took out Haniya in Tehran, and here, although the two events happened on the same night, they were essentially unconnected. The Haniya happened to be in Tehran. Was normally in Qatar, in Doha. He was there for the inauguration of the new Iranian president. The plan apparently, and here all the public stuff is apparent and stitched together, and I have a little bit of better knowledge, but not much, honestly. But the plan apparently was to take him out at the funeral of the previous Iranian president who was killed in the helicopter crash. And the decision was not to, because there were too many civilians around the building. So that also says something about Israel. But my point is that night was coincidental with the Shukr strike.
They happened about 10 hours apart.
Right,
Yeah.
but not planned.
Not planned that way, but I noticed you said we took out, the collective we, meaning
Well,
Israel, took out Haniya.
It was either that or angels. I don't know.
Yes.
It's pretty clear. Now, here we should also keep in mind that the Iranian outrage is that it happened in Tehran. The Iranians don't really care all that much about Haniya or Hamas. I mean, they support them, but the relationship between Iran and Hezbollah is very, very different. It's a much closer relationship. It's a family relationship, if you will, than to Hamas, which is a proxy. They're on the same side. But the fact that it happened in Tehran was a slap to Iran, and their response, or their threatened response, and the conditional will they do it, won't they do it, has to do with the fact that Haniya was frankly not all that important to them. But the strike itself in Tehran was an embarrassment. It was on multiple levels. And with that, they feel an urge to respond, keeping in mind in all of this, and there's all this talk of, I think it was the British foreign minister said, we have to stop this back and forth revenge. This is not back and forth revenge. Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas want to destroy Israel and wipe out the Jews, and we frankly aren't interested. So it's not a tit for tat. It's they want to kill us and we're fighting back.
Yes. This Haniya, I mean, he's been replaced now by Sinwar. Sinwar was basically calling the shots from the tunnels in Gaza already. Right. But what was Haniya's importance? He was the money man.
He was the nominal head of Hamas. I say nominal because, as you said, Sinwar has been calling the shots in Gaza, and with much more independence since October 7th, partly for reputation reasons, and partly for let's call it disconnect reasons. They can't really get to him to put any pressure on him. Haniya also served a very important purpose for Hamas. He was the good cop to Sinwar's bad cop, and was made out to be the kind of moderate pragmatist who was pressing for the ceasefire against Sinwar's refusal. That was a lot of nonsense. That was game playing by masters at it. What's interesting, as far as I'm concerned, is that the Hamas leadership, the Shura Council, as it's called, wanted to appoint Khalid Mashal, who had been the head of Hamas prior. Sinwar and Mashal do not get along, and Sinwar managed not only to veto Mashal's appointment, but to have himself appointed instead. So Hamas has essentially taken off the mask of good cop, bad cop. And it's clear Hamas is Sinwar, the guy who's a psychopath on a good day. Let's remember, this is a guy who was in Israeli prison for murdering Palestinians. He was released during the Gilad Shalit deal, but he was serving 5 life sentences for murdering Palestinians. He murdered 12. Yes, he murdered 12. He was convicted of he was only accused for 5 because 5 life sentences was considered to be enough. Apparently, with the Shalit deal, it wasn't enough. But this is a guy who simply likes to kill people. It doesn't matter, Palestinian, Jewish, Israeli, whatever. He's truly a psychopath, and who sees himself on the winning side still in the war with Israel and Gaza. He sees himself as Saladin reincarnate, who's going to bring the banner of Islam to Jerusalem and throw everybody out of here. So Hamas has moved into that camp totally. If there was any opposition, and I have my doubts, but if there was any opposition to it along the way, it's not there anymore.
Okay, so you have the Hezbollah military commander taken out in Beirut on Tuesday evening. By morning, someone plants a bomb. It seems it's Iranian agents themselves. It seems in Haniya's room, he's taken out. They're livid, they're mad, they're vowing revenge, and yet we've had 8 days of quiet now. And a little more on this. I think one reason is they're a little spooked that they've been infiltrated, and if they try to coordinate some plan with their proxies, they're afraid it'll get leaked.
I think there are a number of factors. That's certainly one of them. I think that once again, the American response caught them by surprise. And here I think a few words about America's involvement in all of this. And I'll try to be as sharply accurate as I possibly can. And I don't want to go into American politics for obvious reasons. America has supported. No. David, you know that I'm an honor graduate of the Israeli Army Mines and Demolitions course, and the first thing they teach you is don't walk into a minefield. Okay. So we're not going there. Okay. But since October 7th, America physically, now I'm talking about physically on the ground, has been fully behind Israel, supplying munitions. By the way, primarily munitions, not so much weapons. This has been an extremely voracious war, and Israel was under-equipped because of poor decisions made in Israel over the past decade. It's a whole story in and of itself, but very, very well supplied all along. At the same time, and I say that positive, at the same time, after about a week or 10 days, the rhetoric of the American government went from solidly pro-Israel to what I'm going to call mushy. It didn't actually turn anti, but it became very well, don't do it this way, stop doing that. And I think up until today, a very good example of it is that whenever Hezbollah attacks, as in the Majd al-Sham's case, that wasn't considered an escalation. But Israel shouldn't respond, according to America, because that might lead to an escalation and a regional war. So when Israel gets hit, America says, well, take it. if Israel wants to respond, it's escalation. Now, what is being heard? Let me just add one more point to that. A lot of noise made here and in other places about the arms shipments being withheld and that sort of thing. There was one particular arms shipment that was being withheld.
With the heavy bombs.
With the heavy bombs, with the Mark 84 2,000-pound bombs. You should know that since October 7th, America has delivered 14,000 of those bombs to Israel. Mm-hmm. So here we're talking about one shipment that made a lot of noise. Now, why is all of this important? Because for the leaders sitting in places like Tehran, they look at American support now as wobbly, as weak. And that leads to them thinking they can get away with a heavy strike against Israel. And as soon as they begin to do that, to think that way, America then turns around and says, hey, we're sending aircraft carriers and planes and other naval units and that sort of thing. And the Iranians say, wait a minute, that wasn't the message that we understood from you yesterday. And I think that is also leading to this pause of now having to take a whole new facet into account in their planning. So whether it'll ultimately lead to them backing down or maybe striking at a target outside of Israel, which they've done in the past, like the Buenos Aires attack on the Jewish community center there, or attacks on embassies. I'm not giving them ideas. This is all stuff that they've done in the past. These are all possibilities in lieu of another cruise missile strike, as they did in April, which failed them miserably and made them look bad on top of it.
Yeah, I think it was embarrassing for them, but it's I guess a bit tiring, exhausting if the U.S. Sends extra forces, extra weaponry here for a few weeks and then brings them back and then has to bring them back every time.
Yes.
Something has to change about that. What about the diplomatic fury? Iran went on their flurry, going to other countries saying our retaliation is justified even against civilian targets. Somehow they felt that was important. I think though that they faced some pushback from Arab Muslim countries worried about that they would endanger Lebanon.
First of all, there's the issue of Lebanon for sure, and that of course includes or primarily is part of the Hezbollah story. But there are other things going on here as well. There is an ongoing Iranian attempt to push into the Middle East, into the Arab world, and being pushed back by Saudi Arabia, by the Emirates, by Jordan to some extent, and being welcomed by Iraq, by Syria. So there's a whole level of diplomatic conflict along with a low-intensity war that's being fought with militias. There was a rocket attack against American troops in Iraq the other night, which, by the way, America did consider to be an escalation. So part of this is diplomacy, part of it is propaganda, part of it is psychological warfare. And by the way, the psychological warfare on their part and Hezbollah's part is working. And this could be another reason why they're delaying. As you know, being in Israel, there's nothing in the news, but when are they going to do it and how are they going to do it and who's going to do it first? And somebody asked me yesterday, someone from the States, do you sleep at night? I sleep at night. I ignore all of this stuff. But the average person doesn't. And I don't want to say that it's led to panic because it's not at that level, but it's stressful and they know it. And why not, let your enemy simmer in it if you can. So I think that's part of the delay calculation on their part as well.
Yeah, Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, said this is part of the punishment that we're making them wait and sweat it out. But they've sweated out themselves over these days because, of course, when we talk about what would Israel do to respond, one thing they could do preemptive strikes. But do you think what Israel did in that one night, I mean, this is very memorable, like in April when, 320, I even read it was as many as 500 cruise, ballistic missiles, and drones shot down in one night. Very embarrassing for Iran. And here Israel in one night takes out these two major figures in these terror militias. Is it restoring fear of Israel, restoring deterrence when it's just Israel facing off against these terror militias and threats?
First of all, I think that the word deterrence should have been stricken from our lexicon on October 7th.
Yes.
We're not deterring them, but they now have to take into account calculations of a reality that they may or may not have believed. In other words, the Israeli strike in the Dahya, for example, was something that they didn't believe would happen because of American pressure. And yesterday and the day before, there are people leaving the Dahya. I'm talking about Hezbollah types and leaders. The Israeli Air Force is flying over the neighborhood and breaking the sound barrier, sort of a friendly reminder we could be here at any time. So it's not the psychological pressure isn't all in one direction; it's in the other direction as well, and those are things that they have to take into account in their planning. Now, the more factors, and this is just a generic statement, the more factors you have to take into account in planning a military operation, the more difficult that military operation is to plan and carry out. So they're thinking of, and you raised it, will Israel preempt? If Israel sees something happening and the Air Force is that prepared to move, can they move in a very short period of time and strike targets? Here again, another military truism. If you catch your adversary as they are about to strike you, they are in their most vulnerable position at that point. And because everything is up and out, up front and out. They know we're watching. Here again, the two strikes on that night, Shukr and Hania, show that we know where these people are. Add Mohammed Def to that picture as well, the Hamas terrorist leader we took out a couple of weeks earlier. Knowing exactly where they're going to be, when they're going to be there, seeing them, knowing it in real time, ascertaining that there aren't any civilians in the area. In other words, knowing a lot of what's going on at the moment. That's kind of scary when you think about it if you're on the other side. There's a lot of looking over your shoulder going on. And as I said, I think that complicates a lot of their decision-making and planning and gives the incentive to say, you know what, maybe we won't do it today. Let's think about tomorrow or the next day and keep doing that.
What do you think Iran and its terror network has in mind? How to attack Israel that's different than in April when it wound up very embarrassing for them. Of course, they did not activate Hezbollah at that time to start just saturating Israel with rockets. And that is certainly something Israel's watching and concerned about. But how would they go about? What might they do this time?
On the assumption that they don't want Israel to respond with a general war against them. And that's an assumption. I can't verify that. I would estimate that it will start, and I hesitate to predict in any way, but with Hezbollah attacks, missile attacks on Israeli military bases, particularly air bases, try to do as much disruptive damage as they possibly can to limit the Israeli Air Force's ability to respond. And after that, here again, depending on how extensive Iran goes, and this is the big if, the Americans are saying they're on the verge of an agreement and getting the whole thing cleaned up and peace in our time and who knows what. The Israeli leadership saying, we don't know what you're talking about. But given everything here going from 0 to 100, I would assume also that Iran would be striking and maybe involve the Houthis in this as well to stretch the Israeli system, but something similar to what they succeeded in doing in April, which was putting a couple of missiles into an Air Force base in the Negev. If they want an all-out war, then they'll hit Tel Aviv.
Mm-hmm.
And both Hezbollah and Iran are capable of doing that.
There have been some indications where they're, warning, different posts or things on the internet about pictures of Tel Aviv, but sort of specific targets, maybe the defense ministry there or something.
Right.
But their missiles aren't that accurate, and it could cause a lot of civilian casualties.
Yes, and here again, if they're interested in civilian casualties, they're perfectly capable of doing that. Mm-hmm. In other words, in hitting civilian areas and causing casualties. If they're interested in not doing that, then they need to be very, very careful not to have a Majd al-Shams scenario happen on a grand scale in Tel Aviv or Haifa or some place like that. It's what I've referred to for many years as the nursery school scenario, that and Majd al-Shams was that. Intentional or inadvertent, when you're firing into populated areas, there's always a chance you're going to cause a great number of casualties, and particularly among children, and that's a game changer as far as Israel's response.
Mm-hmm. Some assessments are saying that Hezbollah, they lost the senior military commander. They have an incentive to get some sort of payback, and they may go out on their own and really try and escalate some, at least in the north.
Hezbollah doesn't do anything on its own. Here again, the myth of Hezbollah as the proxy of Iran. Hezbollah is not a proxy of Iran. Hezbollah is a subordinate group of the Quds Force of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. They take their orders from Iran. And if Iran tells them don't do it, they're not going to do it. Now, do they have some leeway? Yes, but not on a strategic level. If Iran gives them the green light, Iran can always say, well, we didn't do it, they did it. And I think here also it's very important to understand that Hezbollah exists to serve Iran, not the other way around. Okay, so Iran can ditch Hezbollah, or at least distance itself from Hezbollah if it's convenient. Hezbollah cannot distance itself from Iran.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the reason Hezbollah has really held back in this war, there is that artillery duel, the exchanges a little deeper sometimes on both sides of the border, but there's still this concern about the fate of Lebanon itself. And the Lebanese the photos this week showed tons of people on the beaches near Tyre, which is not that far from Israel. So no one thinks there's going to be a big war up in Lebanon, because there's a lot of Arab support for the nation, but not Hezbollah.
Well, I could read it another way, and that is, people think that there's going to be a war next week. Let's go to the beach while we still can. Human psychology isn't linear necessarily. I would say also that we should keep in mind that a few things. One is that already in the aftermath of October 7th, Hezbollah scored a passive but critical victory in the evacuation of the nearly 100,000 Israelis who are still displaced from the north. Every day that goes by is victory points for Hezbollah. So they're in no hurry to resolve this. They're already ahead of the game as far as that goes. A war, kind of changes all of those rules, and it could actually lead to the return of those Israelis to their homes much, much faster. So that's an inhibiting factor in terms of keeping Hezbollah a little more quiet. Another thing to consider is that, we talk about the tit for tat, and certainly Hezbollah is doing quite a bit of damage to northern Israel. But the organization Hezbollah has taken a reasonably serious beating over the last few months at the hands of the Israeli military, air and artillery. And not just the taking out of Fuad Shukr, but a whole bunch of other leaders, field leaders, and as we've done with Hamas. And here I think it's important to mention the single elimination of an individual may or may not be terrifically effective. Now, in Shuker's case, it is. Soleimani under Trump in 2020 was. But Osama bin Laden, for example, was technically irrelevant. I mean, he deserved it. Don't get me wrong, but his elimination didn't have a huge effect on anything other than morale. What Israel is doing to both Hezbollah and Hamas is not a single strike taking out a single leader, but an almost daily operation taking out leadership across the boards that makes it very difficult to fill those positions. It's taking out the reserve of leadership, keeping in mind also that these organizations are not standard military organizations. They don't have a deep reserve of potential replacements. In a regular army, a general gets killed. There are other generals or promotable colonels who can step into the position. That's not true in these organizations. Maybe in one or another, but not across the boards. So they're suffering. Organizationally, they are taking a hit, and that has an effect also on their combat effectiveness.
Yeah, if you had a organizational flow chart, there's going to be X's at all levels of that chart.
Also, just there's a qualitative element here that I think is not known by most people. Look, in a regular military, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking U.S. military or Israeli military, officers serve in their position for a few years, and then they move to another position. They get promoted, they get shifted to another spot from command to staff, from staff to command, and so on and so forth. And then somebody else takes over. That means that you have a lot of people with not a huge amount of experience, but with adequate experience to shift back and forth. A guy like Shuker was in his position for 20 years, and he had been the deputy of Mornia for 15 years prior to that. There is nobody with his experience to take his position. Now, there could be somebody with his qualifications, but it's going to take them a long time to get to where he was. The same thing is true of Mohammed Def in Hamas. Not only was he taken out, and he was also well over 20 years in his position, his deputy, Marwan Issa, was taken out a few months earlier. So we're creating very important gaps in the command structure of these organizations that they will have a very, very hard time to fill.
Yeah. So when you look at the overall war, we're 10 months, over 10 months into it now, and Israel weakening Hamas, even though it's a more limited exchange on the north, weakening Hezbollah. I sense that Israel is regaining its confidence, a lot of it that was lost on October 7, and is starting to dictate the pace of battle, the direction and all. What's your overall view of the state of this conflict right now?
I would say I would agree with what you're saying, but with one caveat. The longer a war like this goes on, the more degrading it is to the system. So there's a counterpoint to the one that you made. Yes, a tremendous degree of gaining of confidence. Combat experience, something the IDF was kind of light on over the years. I mean, it's a good thing, but we haven't had a major war in many, many years. And now units and commanders are combat veterans in very, very difficult circumstances. They've proven themselves. I don't think there's any question. Tactically, the IDF has performed at a very, very high level. However, fatigue has its impact, not only individual human fatigue, but also material fatigue. Long wars. Karl von Clausewitz, the German strategist, wrote about this in his book on war. The offensive tends to wear itself down over time. And I think that's something that also needs to be kept in mind, that as this war goes on, there is a concomitant decline as a result of its length. So it's not a one-way street. I would say overall we're still ahead of in the balance, but it's something that has to be considered because the let's say the advantage curve begins to flatten out. There's a limit to how much combat experience increases your capability, but fatigue is a curve that goes in the opposite direction. It swings upward as time goes on.
Yeah, the societal fatigue as well.
Yes.
You know, the flights in and out of Israel and everything, it's not normal. It's not normal life. Everyone wants to get back to it. I'm sure the people in Gaza are screaming for their lives back. But I always felt that unless and until you got the hostages back, solved that problem in Gaza, Israel wasn't ready to go into the north and actually go into Lebanon. Do you think something has changed in that calculation? Would you send the IDF on the ground into South Lebanon to deal with Hezbollah?
The short answer is yes. I think that the assessment vis-a-vis Hamas is also a dynamic one. In other words, if you had asked me that same question 5 months ago or 6 months ago, my answer would have been much more equivocal, because Hamas was still a much stronger, intact organization then. I think that now we can reasonably say that Hamas has been greatly, greatly degraded, despite the CNN report.
Yeah, I was going to
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, they've recruited new members. Immediately brought to mind, to my mind, what the Germans did in the last few months of World War II, when they created an organization called the Volkssturm, the People's Storm Units, made up of 14-year-old kids and 70-year-old men. Now, I don't think it's quite that extreme with Hamas, but nobody's going to convince me that people who they recruited the last week or month are going to have anywhere near the capability of the guys they've been training for years in Gaza in their training camps. So the numbers are really not much of a story. Hamas is a badly beaten up organization, which needs to be destroyed. But if we were to balance where the threat comes from at the moment, if it were necessary to put Gaza on semi-hold, because it doesn't have to be total, but on semi-hold, in order to move heavy forces up north to deal with Hezbollah, I would say that's a good strategic decision.
Just a little on Gaza, because it's important, the link between the two, and now the U.S. Is saying the efforts to get a diplomatic solution in the north between Israel and Hezbollah has sort of merged with this effort to get a ceasefire and hostage deal in the south. Israel says, where is this coming from? And that maybe the U.S. is talking to Qatar, maybe they know something more. But again, it's all up to Sinwar, isn't it?
It's all up to Sinwar, and I don't see him making a deal. First of all, Sinwar believes that he's winning.
He just got a promotion.
He just got a promotion, exactly. But he sees that he's winning for another reason. If he wants the unified front war against Israel, that's what he was hoping for on October 7th. Making a deal now essentially extinguishes that dream that he's so close to at the moment. So I don't see that happening. Now, again, it's the Middle East. You asked me at the beginning, am I surprised? Nothing would surprise me. But I don't see Sinwar coming to those terms, coming to that deal. It's all the whole American fantasy on this is also based on believing Hezbollah and Nasrallah when he says, well, the minute there's a ceasefire in Gaza, we'll stop shooting up here. Now, Nasrallah is a consummate liar. He's got his own reasons for doing whatever he's doing, but all of this comes back to something that I said earlier. Hezbollah wants to destroy Israel, as does Hamas. So this isn't about, we'll work it out with Sinwar, we'll get back the hostages, and there's going to be peace in the Middle East. And to sort of sharpen that, I want to clarify in terminology. Hamas does not want the end to this war. Hezbollah does not want the end to this war. Iran doesn't want the end to this war. The end of the war, as far as they're concerned, is the destruction of Israel. What they want is the end of the Israeli offensive against Hamas in Gaza, to allow Hamas to rebuild itself to continue the war in 3, 4, 5 years down the road when they're capable of doing it. But this is not about ending the war in any way, shape, or form, despite the dreams of the United States, the White House, the State Department, and those people.
Yeah, you mentioned the White House. There's an election. I know we don't want to wade into it, but is it affecting the calculations here at all? Is Israel waiting for maybe a friendlier occupant of the White House?
It's possible. I think that if that is the case, it's a poor decision. As we all know, politics, the only polls that count are the ones that happen on election day, and you don't know the outcome of that until the next day. And no matter what, who's going in, we don't know who's coming out. If the Israeli government is thinking we're going to wait this out until January, and maybe there'll be a different administration and we'll have more support. January is a long way off, and there's no guarantee that in January the situation is going to be any different than it is today. So, to my way of thinking, it's too long to wait for too risky an outcome to allow the situation to go on. Keeping in mind, waiting to January to start operating against Hezbollah, for example, means that the people of the north who are evacuated will be out of their homes for over a year and a half by the time anything even begins to rebuild in that area. How many of them are not going to come home? How much of the north is going to be permanently devastated? And every day that goes by increases the number of those people who are going to say, you know what, I'm happy where I am, not as happy as I was, but I got to make my life, and I'm going to pick it up from here and go ahead. So I think it's a very, very bad decision.
You live in the north, just below that line of evacuation yourself, so you have a heart for these people. And if I hear you clearly, if we boil it down, this show, how should Israel respond? You're saying it's time to send the ground forces in. Would you do it sooner rather than later?
I would do it sooner rather than later for a few reasons. One that I mentioned, the clock is ticking on all of the displaced Israelis. But there's another factor. It's August already. The rainy season is coming September, October, and that's going to make operations on the ground all the more difficult. It will make air support all the more complicated. A winter war is not conducive. We can fight it if we have to, but it's not conducive, and that clock is ticking as well. So waiting here is not the answer. Just to add one other aspect to this, the talk of an agreement with Hezbollah, moving them back 7 kilometers, 8 kilometers, 10 kilometers, Litani, all of that. The ultimate arbiter of whether an agreement with Hezbollah is a good one or a bad one is that population of nearly 100,000 Israelis who are displaced. They're not going home if they think this is going to start up again in another year or two. And that's really, they're really the judges of whether it'll be secure in the north or not. And it's my belief that any agreement with Hezbollah is not a guarantee of security from the day that it's signed or come to.
Yes. So do you think a wide-scale ground incursion into southern Lebanon could accomplish something quickly so that these folks would be able to come back? Could you do it before, say, the fall rains in October, November?
It's hard to estimate time in these sort of things, but the major portion of an operation can certainly be done in a month or two. Now it may entail fighting beyond that and that sort of thing, but Lebanon is a small enough country, and we saw this in 1982, and we saw it again in failed operations in 2006, and even going back to 1978 to the Litani operation. Israeli ground forces, mobile forces, armored forces, certainly have the capability of taking that ground in a short period of time. How long it will take to reduce Hezbollah in those places, in the ongoing fighting, similar in that sense to Gaza, although very different in terms of the nature of the fighting, is hard to tell. It might take many, many months, but at least to have the maneuver element of it concluded by, as I said, by the rainy season, would be a very smart strategic move.
Okay. I think we're going to leave it there. We've been talking to IDF Major in the reserves, Elliot Chodoff, about the current standoff, the waiting period, Israel waiting to see if Iran and Hezbollah will retaliate for the death of two of their main leaders last week, a leader of Hamas and a leader of Hezbollah, and what Israel should be doing to respond. We thank you, Elliot, for your time and expertise. God bless
Always
you.
a pleasure.
Stay safe up there.
Thank you.
Okay, and that's our show for today. Thank you again for joining us, and we want to invite you back next week for the ICEJ webinar series every Thursday at 3 p.m. here, Israel time, from Jerusalem. And also at the top of the hour now, you can join our daily global prayer gathering, praying with Christian leaders and intercessors from around the globe at our global daily prayer gathering at 4 p.m. every day, Israel time. Join us then. See you next week here from the Christian Embassy's TV studios.
Thank you for joining us for this informative webinar. Be sure to subscribe to our social media channels or visit our website at icej.org for upcoming webinars and more ICEJ exclusive content.
His name.
October the 7th, 2023.
Want to stay up to date with the latest developments in Israel?
Make sure to check out our weekly recap where we give you the most important headlines every single Monday.
Follow us on our social media to stay notified.